I will start with Dylan's been providing me with some good fodder because he keeps on telling me and telling all of you that I have the inside information on what's going on here, and that I'm a really great advocate, and then I'm an old-timer in terms of bicycle advocacy. I've been around for, I think, a whole 4.5, maybe 5 years in this world, and getting to know Seattle. So I think it's kind of ironic to have to feel like I have to recount the story and the history of what's been going on in kind of bicycling in the city of Seattle for the last 112 years or so. But that's what I'll attempt to do a little bit. But what I think really is important for you all to know is the fact that I've only really been involved in this for roughly 4 to 5 years, along with folks like Craig over here and Max, who were involved in the advocacy movement in Seattle and across the state now. I think really speaks to the kind of dynamicism of bicycling and how fast things are changing. And I'm going to start to talk a little about that if we go next. So the purpose of the talk is really to provide some context and some history of, as I understand it, knowing that I've only been around for a few years, to talk a little bit about the existing 2007 Bicycle Masterplan, to think about some of the issues that we should really contemplate, both within the Greenways, world of Greenways, as well as the larger context of the update, and then to talk about next steps. And kind of in reference to where Dylan was coming from, one of the things this is not about is it's not about my role in direct advocacy around kind of politics or organizing efforts, because I really think that in the majority of my time around Seattle, I haven't been as much a part of that. I've been much more involved with the Seattle Bicycle Advisory Board, and I'll get to this, but I think there's an inherency in the fact that bicycling is so far behind the curve that even though we're an advisory board, what we do is inherently advocacy, just because there's nothing else out there. And so in order to just establish norms and ideas as to what standards should be in the City of Seattle and within City of Seattle staff, what we do is advocacy, even if it's advisory. So that's really when Dylan talks about me being an advocate. For the majority of my time, it's really been much more so as being an advisor and trying to work on the inside, and also trying to support on the inside staff and other folks, and be a resource for folks like Councilmember Bagshaw, who, I mean, I think it's pretty fair to say we wouldn't have this update without her leadership over the last year, and with all of your guys' I think really important push over the last year. So just to say that you guys are kind of the players in the City of Seattle now, and it's not just a few of us. Next. So just a little bit of history. This is a bicycle map from 1900, and I think it's just important to note that this has been going on for a while in various forms. Ballard was still a city at this time, but you can see the dotted lines of different pathways that really were moving forward. 1972 was kind of around the OPEC crisis, and that was when the first bikeway plan in the City of Seattle really came about. I think it's interesting to note at that point, that's kind of when you read history about Copenhagen and other cities, that's when those European cities also looked at the situation and said, we're going to move forward on bicycling. Unfortunately, I don't think the City of Seattle took that path in the fork in the road. They had a plan, but it was somewhat limited. And what I think Seattle, kind of in line with the rest of America, really followed two big trends over the last, say, 30 or so years. One around the Rails to Trails movement, which we saw huge efforts through the Burke-Gilman Trail, taking that former railroad road, and that's really where the City of Seattle put a lot of its energy, especially in the 80s and into the 90s, as well as the vehicular cycling movement, which really talked about, that bicycles should be just like cars, you should follow the rules of the road, League of American Bicyclists, all that kind of stuff really influenced folks who were spandex-clad racers, and that's really where the city was for, I think, 30 years. And I think just in the last 3-4 years, since the 2007, which was a real big juncture, is where we start to get this kind of Copenhagenized separation, greenways, thinking about, in fact, I think greenways are really all about creating kind of shared spaces, creating winners in our neighborhoods and taking back the public right-of-way for all people and not just for a certain segment who chooses it through your neighborhood. Next. So, I sort of talked a little bit about this, but I mean, this is Seattle pre-2007, and Sally, maybe you have this great opportunity, but for the Parks Department, I think it's fair to say it was the biggest funder of bicycle facilities before 2007 in the city of Seattle. The engineering department, C-Trans, or SDOT, they really weren't there. Those projects, like I said, were really around trails. The Burke-Gilman Trail, the Friends of the Burke, all that kind of stuff was really where we were putting our energies. And some of the folks that were involved in SDOT were really, I think, kind of cowboys. They had to make deals. There wasn't really any institutional support or any kind of positive feedback mechanisms for them to actually move forward and create a real system whereby project managers were rewarded for including bicycle facilities in their projects. And so you had wheeling and dealing where planners from SDOT were working with planners from the Parks Department to get some of these things done. And that's sort of what I say. Next. So 2007 was a pretty big watershed year, and I think it really has changed where we're at and has given us kind of that push forward. And again, I'm really talking, I think, from an institutional point of view as opposed to the outside advocacy point of view. But we had the Bicycle Master Plan that was unanimously passed by council. Complete Streets Ordinance was also passed, I think, the leadership of a number of folks. Great City, Michael McGinn was right in there, Cascade, a whole bunch of different folks. And then the 2006 Virginia Gap Levy was passed, which gave bicycling its first real chance at being funded. Before that, there wasn't any real dedicated sources of funding, as far as I know, for bicycles, for bike lanes, or for anything like that. It was always ad hoc. It was always, hey, wouldn't this be a good idea if we tag this onto this existing roads project? Next. So during the development of the Bicycle Master Plan, and right after, at the point in which it was about to be passed, one of the Bicycle Advisory Board members, and really it was focused on separated facilities in the Bicycle Master Plan. Everyone else said that is crazy talk, including the big bike advocate in the city who said bikers should be taught to act like cars. It doesn't work from an engineering standpoint to separate bikes from traffic. I mean, that was pretty well where we were at, and that was 5 years ago, almost to the date. And what this did is, and this is actually a really important article for me, because this article, I think, made me aware of the Bicycle Advisory Board and made me interested in what was going on and why was Peter Lagerway getting demoted for this Bicycle Advisory Board member speaking out on behalf of separated facilities in the Bicycle Master Plan and saying that the Bicycle Master Plan was itself flawed. So for me, this article is kind of really important to me, so I kind of hold it near and dear. And I think it really exemplifies where bicycle advocacy was only 5 years ago in the city of Seattle. Next. So for me, some of the observations coming out of that, it was still done before that Copenhagenized thing across the nation, before New York was creating separated facilities, before Rahm Emanuel in Chicago was doing all the things he's doing in the last 6 months to create cycle tracks, before bike share was anything. And so I think we see a real inherent tension that the project manager from the Bicycle Master Plan was really a trails guy. And there was a real push for on-street facilities to kind of build out that network. And that's sort of a tension that we see. It's outdated. It's only 5 years old, but it's so outdated already. And cycle tracks were something that, as we saw from the previous article, was something that was just verboten in this plan. And the recommended facilities, because I think it was only $100,000 or $150,000 plan. The recommended facilities were really just the consultant team driving along the roadways or bicycling or what have you, and saying, I think we can fit in a bike lane here. I think we can do sharrows here, what have you. But there wasn't really any thorough analysis, which has caused a lot of problems in terms of poor Sam here, who kind of can say what she's going to do on any given year in terms of implementation, but until they go out and actually measure the road and look at the site characteristics and everything else, we don't really know what the heck is going to go in. And so those are some of kind of my gut issues with the plan itself. Next. Oh yeah, so it lacks separation. It lacks adequate direction for public involvement, which I think has really been an issue for SDOT, for SAM, For traffic management, which Sam's division, which she's part of, and the bicycle program is a part of within SDOT, which I think has a few issues with public outreach and engagement in general, and the bicycle master plan didn't really help that. I talked about the design specs, and I think another really critical one is the fact that the bicycle master plan really lacked a project manager who could cut across the silos within the departments in the city. So SDOT's doing some stuff, but there's requirements for the Seattle Police Department to do things. We have tried for the last year or 2 years to try to talk to the police department. Haven't really had too much success at that, even though there's issues with SBD not doing adequate enforcement. There's issues with parking enforcers using bike lanes as their own and as parking lanes and everything else. All sorts of issues that the bike master plan sort of speaks to, but no one's speaking to SBD to talk to them about that. And the same thing, there's better coordination with SPU, I think in large part because it's personality driven. Ray Hoffman, the director of SPU, is a huge bicyclist and is really interested in this movement. DPD has some recommendations, there's some recommendations in the plan for DPD that may or may not have happened. And so I think that's something that would be really valuable in a future update, is figuring out how everybody's going to be communicating to each other. And I think it will really help coordinate, and it will really be important for folks in the Neighborhood Greenways movement, because I think, as everyone has recognized, this is such a kind of multidisciplinary movement in a way. You know, you're talking about pedestrians, you're talking about bicycles, you're talking about utilities, you're talking about parks. You're just doing so much that cuts across all those silos of camp. Next. I talked a little bit about it, but just so you know a little bit more, Bicycle Advisory Board, founded in '77 by resolution, so we're like 15, 20 years older than the other advisory boards. We're the stewards of the Bicycle Master Plan. We have some obsessive membership. I will be one of those people, and I think there are a couple others in the room. What we saw, I think, as you know, there's a couple of alumni in the room as well. I think what we saw in 2007, 2008 was there was a real opportunity for us to serve as a backstop in that same way, and that we could be kind of neutrals in a way that the regular outside advocates could not, and we could help maybe support some of the staff inside and try to make bridges between the electeds that at the time didn't really even know that the Bicycle Advisory Board existed, and also to try to make bridges and educate electeds on what the Bicycle Master Plan could actually do. So a lot of, more so, I think our tact has always been behind the scenes as opposed to your typical advocacy of sending out press releases, things like that. And I talked about the inherent advocacy of our advisory. And this is Bill Nye, the science guy who was an advisory board member back in the 80s. Next. And I talked a little bit about this, but I think before a few of us started, there was an inherent inclination to be a watchdog on the advisory board, and I think that came out of a certain frustration because we don't have staff support, because people didn't really know how to interact. If any of you have read Tom Vanderbilt's Traffic, it's the same kind of sense of like when you're driving a car and why people get really angry and yell and stuff like that, because you're kind of sensory deprived. You know, you can't really communicate to that person you're angry at. You have your horn, you have your middle finger, and that's about it. And I think that's what has happened in the past with the advisory boards, is they didn't really have a means to communicate. They were sort of in this little ghetto within SDOT, within traffic management within SDOT, and those are the only people we were ever able to really talk to. So over the last 5 or so years, we've really tried to get outside that ghetto and talk across SDOT, talk to other departments, talk to council members, talk to the mayor, so we could be more effective, but at the same time be much more diplomatic and not yell at people, not yell at Sam saying, how can you be doing such a bad job? Because we realize that ultimately, for all of us in this room, if Sam can't do her job, we're not going to get greenways, we're not going to get bike lanes, and so we should do everything we can to help make her job easier, to create that golden bridge to move forward. And I think that's been sort of the tack for the advisory board, and I hope that's the tack moving forward. I don't know if I missed anything, but let's go forward. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, and I hope I'm I'm okay. A little bit about some of the other things that I think are kind of swimming around as we talk about the update and really are pressing in my mind for the advisory board, for bicycle world, for mobility. And two big things are major projects and light rail. Major projects include things like the Mercer project, Mercer East, which really started in 2003, and all we got out of it was a lousy bike lane going through here, even though it's a $180 million project, and it sort of sucked the air out of the room for all of the other potential granting opportunities in the last few years. I think it's a really lost opportunity. So and the same thing with the Spokane Street Viaduct, which had been moving forward for quite some time. The bicycle master plan calls for a multi-use trail underneath it, and SBAB put in a 10-foot wide sidewalk. And these are huge opportunities where there's millions of dollars being spent, and it wouldn't be that much more to give us bicycle facilities. Same thing with the South Colgate to King Street Viaduct replacement project. We're getting a minimal spec trail, even though it's really nice for West Seattle folks because we've had such a bad situation in the past. It's sort of like giving little bits of food to someone who's starving. It's like, this is the greatest thing ever, but it's not. We can do better. And we need to start getting in early on a lot of these projects before they get to 60%, 90%, because we have lost those opportunities with Mercer East, with South Colgate, with Spokane Street Viaduct. And that's something I encourage all of you to do, and I'll start to talk a little bit why I think that's really germane for Greenways people to think about as well. Next. Not quite yet, but soon I will. Funding. I mean, these are things I think we need to think about. Bridging the gap is, like I said, is huge. Major projects have really been impactful in the way that we, as kind of in the bicycle world, can really get SDOT to apply for those grants, because there's always something new and big out there with Mercer West. Now, we need to get more grants for that, and that precludes our ability to get grants for a Greenways network. To do something like, I think one of Portland's Tiger grants was actually to create a Greenways network. I mean, and that's something that Metro was going for because they didn't have these other huge projects that were just sucking the air out of the room. So we talked about that. State level funding is abysmal right now. The governor just released her transportation package today. There's not one reference to active transportation. Transit is underfunded. Safe Routes to School was going to be funded in the past package last year, and it's not this year. There's a lot of work that we can do, and I think we should continue to push on the state for that. And Councilmember Bagshaw already mentioned the loss of proposition line last year. Next. So we've talked about this. For me, kind of the updated wish list, and there are more, and I know Eli and folks here sent a letter. The Seattle Bicycle Advisory Board has also sent a letter recommending what could be in the scope of the bicycle master plan. I know other folks are going to be really playing into it. For me, intersections, and it's something that even this year I really want the Bicycle Advisory Board to really focus harder on intersections. And currently SDOT is really not, I don't think, being as responsive as they could be on that. I mean, I think it's pretty natural. It's like the place where most collisions occur, and yet even with great facilities like Dexter, when we get to the intersection of Nickerson and Fremont and everything else, all of a sudden, you're on your own. Good luck. You know, we have this great intermediary, buffered bike lane, but nothing where the real collisions can occur. And that's really frustrating, and I think it's something that really needs to be addressed. Councilmember Bagshaw, we talked about this really great Dutch intersection design, which probably a lot of you have seen on YouTube. I mean, there are ways for us to focus on that. And there's a really great article by a University of Washington researcher, which I have a quote from coming up, which talks about that there's actually real evidence that you have to focus on intersections and you'll reduce collisions. It's good. Calmer, more separated cycle tracks, greenways, better data. I know it's good that we have to all go out and volunteer at 6 in the morning to collect data, but I think there's a certain kind of weirdness that the car data isn't collected by volunteers as well. It's automated. There's 8 FTEs, I think, at SDOT that are devoted to counting cars and managing data. We need more of that for bicycles and pedestrians so we can have a better approach. Signalization is again huge. Transit and school connectivity. So greenways, they shouldn't just be new bicycle facilities. We've talked about that. They should be part of utility projects. They're part of pedestrian projects. The inter-neighborhood network, I think, is really important. But the larger city-wide network is really critical, and it's not going to just be greenways. It's going to be bridges, it's going to be trails, it's going to be cycle tracks. I think that's not because I hate greenways or anything like that, but because I think it's the geography, topography, and the built environment that we live in the city of Seattle does not allow us to have a perfect grid system that's going to get us those kind of calm, separated, non-arterial roadways from which we can create greenways throughout the city of Seattle. Next. This is the article that just came out by this University of Washington researcher talking about characteristics of the built environment that have a direct impact on crashes. And specifically, she really, her and her co-authors really start to talk about intersection design, bike boxes, things like that. And you can find this either by just taking that article or the title, or Streets Blog has, I think, some more kind of analysis on it. And this is something Adam Trask from Transpo Group, Seattle Transit Blog did a year or two ago with his master's thesis around a GIS analysis, really talking about the fact that we live in a city of islands, if you will. And what we really need to do is create essentially boats to those different islands. And so I'm all for creating greenways on those islands. But what the boats look like, I think really that's when we start to have to talk about that more diversified, separated structure or network, which is the cycle tracks, the bridges, those other types of things. And I think that's the only way we're really going to create a great network. Next. So I think that's getting to the end of things. You guys are doing fantastic. I think it's important to know that, I mean, the update wouldn't probably be here without all your involvement. And I think you guys have to kind of consider yourselves to be kind of the people that are kind of entrenched experts at this point in time. Mainly because things are moving so fast that you have taken, I think, bicycle infrastructure to a new level, and you really need to kind of own up to that and realize that you guys are doing a lot. And the fact that there's a commitment from SDOT for 11 miles of greenways over the next, annually is nothing to like. It's really amazing. I think you need to recognize, like I said, that they're not the only answer. There's a lot more, and I encourage you to kind of reach out and look at some of those. Even though some of those places might not be quite as green, they might be a little gray, a little industrial. I'm looking at you, Becca. It's important. And I guess that's kind of my call, is to find the others that are working on some of these issues that might not always be greenway people, they might be trail people, but they can also be your allies. And I kind of encourage and implore all of you to think about a more diversified network, even though I think you guys are doing fantastic at that. And then my own kind of pitches is that kind of on the state level, since that's a lot of where my work is now really pointing to, is thinking about that state funding, especially around things like local options, is incredibly important, because right now, what we can do to fund these networks is really hampered by the fact that we don't always have the tools, the funding tools, and that's something that can be granted to us on the state level. There's some great legislation out there. One is the Neighborhood Safe Speeds Bill, which would give cities and towns the authority to set speed limits at 20 miles per hour. That's something that Oregon just passed last year, and it specifically applied for greenways. So I encourage you to look into that and more. Talk to me if you want to. And another pitch that I think a lot of us would have in this room is, it would be really fantastic if all you guys could come down to Olympia on January 31st for Transportation Advocacy Day to meet your legislators, to talk to them about some of these bills and how important all this is. I think next, I don't know if there's anything else. That's it. I stole a lot of photos from Sally. I didn't put the rest up. So I don't know if there are any questions.